I think that what our task needs to be is not to try to win over fascists, not to try to find common ground, but actually work on the decent people to transform these tens of millions of people into a force that could actually defeat the fascists.
A lot of people think that tuning in means that if I listen, if I look, all I can do is bear witness to it. And yeah, that would be awful. But the point of looking, the point of tuning in is to take that understanding of that threat, of the reality that this is a regime that imperils humanity and the planet itself, and we can't let that stand, and then act on that. That's what tuning in is for. Welcome to episode 232 of the Refuse Fascism podcast, a podcast brought to you by volunteers with Refuse Fascism. I'm Sam Goldman, one of those volunteers and host of the show. Refuse Fascism exposes and analyzes the threat we face, promotes efforts to defend people targeted by the fascists, and most essentially, challenges, mobilizes, and inspires the non-fascist majority of people living in this country to engage in determined, defiant collective action to defeat this American fascist threat. Today, we're sharing a discussion between myself and one of the show's co-producers, who happens to be my husband, Mark Tinkleman, where we discuss the lack of visible resistance against the rising tide of fascism represented by Trump MAGA's return to the White House. I want to thank our patrons, our sustainers who make the show possible, everyone who rates and reviews the show on Apple Podcasts or their listening platform of choice. It boosts the show so much. So please, after listening to today's episode, take a moment to rate and review. Thanks to those who share the show, everyone who buys our merch to support and spread the show. If you want to get yours, see the show notes. I want to take a moment to just lift up a couple comments that we have gotten over on the YouTubes off of last week's episode. Jesus Gonzalez, JD9KB, commented, excellent presentation, excellent call to action to stand up to fascism. And at Barar283 wrote, wow, this is yet again a brilliant explanation of what fascism is all about. People are just not aware of the very real dangers these Christian fascists are bringing to each and every one of you who are not white and Christian with blonde hair and blue eyes. People need to wake up. We, the people, must band together and stand against this fascist regime. Thank you both for your comments, for listening, and for being part of this community. After today's episode, again, be sure to share your thoughts with us. You can comment on YouTube, like the audience members that I just quoted from, or again, rate and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. It really does make a difference. Before we get to our first episode of this new, and let's face it, scary as fuck year, we gotta touch base briefly on some developments related to the fascist DEFCON level. Today is January 5th, so that means tomorrow is January 6th, 2025, 4 years since Trump's rolling coup exploded into violence at the Capitol. And that's what it was. Despite the fascist mass delusion that January 6th was both a totally normal day and simultaneously an Antifa conspiracy, despite Merrick Garland's insistence that these events that we all witnessed in real time were somehow so complicated that it must take years to put together a case against its leaders, a day late and a dollar short, despite all too many liberal politicians, thinkers, and pundits saying we just have to put this behind us and find common ground with the fascists. Despite the Supreme Court's insistence that this categorically wasn't an insurrection, forcing states to blatantly deny reality and keep Trump on their ballots, despite all this, it must be reasserted again and again that this was an orgy of violence planned by Trump and his closest advisors, along with organized white supremacist gangs and militias, and kicked off by Trump himself, all with the intention of retaining power, invoking emergency powers, and possibly killing a few of his perceived enemies in the process. There has been zero accountability. The so-called guardrails of democracy, a supposedly independent judiciary and Department of Justice, the 14th Amendment, the very concept of the rule of law all thrown out the window. But more than that, the fascist coup is now succeeding beyond its wildest dreams of its participants. Just ask them. As Capitol riot defendants are flocking to the inauguration on January 20th, reportedly asking courts permission to return to DC on January 20th to be in attendance at the inauguration, some at the personal invitation of Republican elected officials, to witness their ringleader take back the Oval Office, promising to pardon his foot soldiers starting day one within the first few hours. Some may argue that it's not a coup anymore, since Trump got reelected. But what do you call it when a man so clearly disqualified by the plain language of the 14th Amendment is allowed to waltz back into power because no one in the government or the ruling class parties is willing to enforce the law of the land, law born from the unimaginable bloodshed of the American Civil War? No election, fair or fraudulent, can legitimize fascism. As bad as the normal workings of America's so-called democracy is, the political context of this anniversary should have alarm bells ringing across the country, waking people up to the fact that normalcy is gone and not coming back. Moving on to some other developments. While much is still being determined regarding the motives and details of the mass killing of 14 people by a Texas-born U.S. Army veteran on New Year's in New Orleans, that, of course, did not stop Trump and the MAGA fascists from exploiting this event to ramp up fear and hatred of, quote-unquote, the enemy from within, to justify attacks on immigrants, Muslims, and ramp up repression of political opponents. Facts be damned. Framing chaos as a pretext for control, he's laying the groundwork for policies targeting oppressed communities and dissenters. This tactic is a stark warning of the looming fascist threat. Trump's incoming quote-unquote border czar, Tom Homan, has announced plans for large internment camps, misleadingly called quote-unquote family facilities, designed to expedite mass deportations. This chilling move signals a return to some of the most inhumane policies of the Trump era, doubling down on cruelty as a cornerstone of immigration enforcement. The normalization of such camps should alarm anyone who values human dignity and the rights of migrant families. Thanks to Trump's explicit support, theocrat Mike Johnson has been reelected with narrow majority vote as House Speaker, one of the most powerful positions in the U.S. government. During his acceptance speech, Johnson reaffirmed commitment to Trump's MAGA fascist agenda, anti-immigrant, drill, 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 reversing any efforts to combat climate change, drastically cut social services, restructure the federal government in ways that bolster the executive, and of course, keep the military stronger than ever. While presenting Johnson the gavel, Hakeem Jeffries again promised that House Democrats would, quote, work hard to find common ground with our Republican colleagues in the incoming administration on any issue, whenever and wherever possible, end quote. With that, here is my conversation with Mark. As promised, I am so happy to get to chat with today's co-participant, Mark Tinkleman. Hey, Mark.
Hi, glad to be here.
Mark and I have been talking about doing this for a while, speaking to a lot of really important questions that y'all have sent in, including in our episode right after the election. There were some really important questions that we wanted to return to. I think it's having this conversation and speaking to these questions, I think, is part of how we prepare for this fight ahead.
Absolutely.
I thought it would be good to just get into it, unless you have anything that you wanted to say.
Well, I'm just glad that we're doing this. I'm Mark Tinkleman. I am a co-producer of the Refuse Fascism podcast. Yeah, we've been, especially from the forum that we did right after the election, which I think people should probably go back and listen to, we got a lot of very direct questions from a lot of very concerned people. And they're the kind of questions that we try to answer on the podcast every week on the big picture. And we also want to address them very directly, including using the experience that Sam and I have, both all the conversations that Sam has had on the podcast, all the work that we did during Trump's first term, very directly and hands-on mobilizing people in Philadelphia and nationally to drive out that regime, and all the experience that we've had for years before that in various movements for justice and for a radically better world.
Yeah, I really appreciate that you brought that up. If you're listening to the podcast, which you are right now, you might wonder, with very good reason, with the danger this time presented by not just Trump, but with the whole Republi-fascist party and the MAGA mob of, we can say, tens of millions of people, where the fuck is the resistance? Why, given that the danger level is even higher than last time, that it truly is an existential threat, not that it wasn't last time, to humanity and the planet, but why don't we see the streets flooded and society pulsing with mass refusal to the white supremacy, mass refusal to the overt misogyny in all its forms? Why don't we see mass refusal to this xenophobia, this mass deportation plan?
I think one thing to look at that's very directly parallel is what's happening in South Korea right now. I'm going to draw some things out that I think are contrasting between how that's developed and what's happening here. The answer that we get from a lot of people is that people are exhausted, is that people have been fighting this for so long, that they're burnt out. And first of all, I want to say that if I thought that the only possibility was to just be a thorn in the side of these fascists, yeah, I would be very tired. But I don't think that that's true. I think we can actually defeat them. And the contrast I want to get into with South Korea is that they drove out a president and their administration in 2016, was it?
But let's stop and check. South Korea, President Park, 2017, I guess, or would it start in?
It started in 2016, and then she was out in 2017 and arrested. And yet somehow, less than 10 years later,
December 9th, 2016, was impeached.
And that took months of millions of people, literally millions, in the streets saying we are not going to accept being governed in this way any longer. And they did that. And once she was impeached, they came back to make sure she was arrested and removed. And now we have a situation, not even 10 years later, where people are doing something very similar.
President Yoon.
With President Yoon, who really is embodying the reactionary, Christian fundamentalist, anti-communist.
Really Trumpy.
Really
Trumpy.
He's very Trumpy. And he tried to impose martial law. And people are not accepting it. They stopped the martial law after people resistance broke out immediately. And then people have been pushing for his impeachment. And right now, we're seeing a situation where some of the forces of law and order are trying to arrest him. And some of those same forces of law and order are preventing that from happening physically.
If I read it correctly, they physically stopped his arrest.
Oh, yeah. It was a physical confrontation. No one was shot or anything like that.
And he was, in similar ways, calling forth his supporters in the spirit of, like, instead of stop the steal, it was...
There were literally signs there saying stop the steal. Literally signs there. There is also the parallel that in their most recent election, even though Yoon came out on top, they still said that there was all this fraud and all that kind of shit. So I don't think it's something where just human nature, first of all, I don't think there's something human nature, but I definitely don't think there's something in human nature that says that people can't resist fascism, can't resist hated regimes within a few years of trying to do it last time. And I think that it is also reflective of the difference in American history and South Korean history.
Oh, for sure.
Not to get too into the rabbit hole, but since 1980, people in Korea have been, specifically through mass action, in a number of different forms, have been ousting dictators. And in the United States, we have a situation where there has been such deep-seated parasitic stability in this country for so long.
Can you explain to people what that means?
I'm talking about, especially since World War II, I'm talking about the fact that this empire, the American empire, had various challenges, but has been the top dog of at least the largest imperialist bloc, and now in the whole imperialist system, with not really any challengers at the moment. There has been social tumult and stuff, but essentially this country has had the peaceful transition of power going back much further than World War II. They've had these quote-unquote democratic ideals, a constitution that has changed in the way that it's perceived, but has been consistent for over 200 years. And all of this is buoyed by the fact that the profits and the stuff that Americans have is based on the super super exploitation of people all over the world. So we have that situation, that stability, that parasitism, for as long as anyone can remember in this country. There's been essentially stability. And what's happening now with Trump is actually very destabilizing. And a lot of good people in this country don't know what to do with that. Even people's better angels, the things that people wish were reality, equality, an end of world hunger and all that kind of stuff, they've been allowed to sort of think that we're going in that direction for a long time, even though generally speaking, that was not the case. But now that's over. There's no going back to the 90s. There's no going back to the 50s. The stability of this empire is over. And that can mean a lot of different things. But right now, most good people in this country are essentially rudderless. And we can get deeper into that.
I think that last part resonates a lot. I think that there are so many lessons that we can and should be learning from South Korea and what it means to stand up and not do it once and not do it twice, but what it means for a whole society to pulse with refusal and what it means for the refusal to be what sets the terms and to not allow the normal functionings to proceed unless and until that demand is met. And I think that there's a lot to learn from it, that they didn't stop at impeachment, that they didn't stop at one impeachment, that they didn't stop at martial law, that they were not cowed. And there's a lot of lessons in courage, in bravery, in persistence, in not allowing the way things are, preventing the way things must be. I think that there's a lot of lessons there, right, including on the power at certain times of nonviolent resistance. And I think that the points that you were making about American parasitism, that sucking up all the spoils of the world and the way that that pacifies people, then what happens when the stability, the world that you thought that you lived in, and that sense of justice that you thought just existed, and the people who you thought were surrounding you, and the idea that, I think people thought, I think that there was that moment of reckoning in 2016 where many people, for the first time, had to look at the fact that the America that they thought they had is not the America that is.
Yeah, I mean, people saying, this isn't what America's about, and then having a look through the history and being like, oh, shit.
Well, and still many people didn't look at that history.
Right.
Many people didn't go there. They just looked at the fact that somebody who doesn't win the popular vote becomes a president. Not my president became a thing. How can that be?
Right.
And then the fact that they were sensing, even though it wasn't the majority of people that voted for Trump, the fact that they had to come to grips with that there was this base of people for whom the pussy grabbing and the just anti-immigrant vitriol
the
and the racist, all of that was not disgusting, but compelling.
Right.
And I think that shook people. But when it shook people then, it shook many people to feel the need to say no. Right. And I think that people now are wrestling with the fact that we have evidence that we didn't have before of who Trump is, of who these Republi-fascists are, of what they did, of the Muslim ban, of the child separation, of the mass murder through direct actions and inaction during COVID, of,
January 6th,
of all of that. And then everything since then, the literally Mein Kampf or Mussolini, depending on his day, direct channeling.
Right.
It's a change in rhetoric, yes, but it's also the fact that it's fueling real world violence. And that there is Project 2025. It's not hidden. There is a clear blueprint. You look at his cabinet nominations and appointments. You look at the fact that they are going for the largest mass deportation in history. And let's be clear, this country has had some pretty grotesque history of mass deportations. So thinking about that and then looking at the streets, and people are right to think, yes, there are some plans of protest. I don't want to discount those. The People's March, the fact that some people came out for the 14th now, I think January 3rd. But largely, let's be real, you're met with silence. Article after article, where is the resistance, and different thought pieces on, yes, people being tired or people being just over it. And I think that what you were saying about if all that there is doing more of the same of what people are doing, left in the confines of pressuring or focusing on elections that are increasingly irrelevant when faced with a fascist who's told you that he wants to be in power indefinitely and plans on it and discards every norm and creates new laws to restrict the rights of voting or the relevancy of voting.
Right.
I think that, why would you think that you should do anything?
Absolutely. And I wanted to tease out one of the things that you were talking about in terms of the difference between 2016 and now. And one thing I don't want to do is I don't want to act like the world hasn't changed since then. I don't want to act like these are just a bunch of different ideas. Like we had some ideas back then and, new ideas grew out of those old ideas. No, the world moves on. We're in a different global situation. So I don't want to get stuck in this. There's a lot of pieces right now that are like the 2017 playbook can't be our resistance. That's true. But what I want to get at is that there was this level of superficiality when people took to the streets immediately after the election. People think about the pink pussy hats and that kind of thing. There was a level of what Sam described as like people being like, this isn't our America, and then not looking into the fact that, yes, it is. And a lot of people now are saying that there was a lot of superficiality. The buzzword is performativeness of that time. But the fact is that it was still right that people took to the streets. It was still actually a very good thing.
Yeah.
That people...
And I think that that's what we did get into in last week's episode.
Yeah. I think people should definitely re-listen to a lot of things that we've said. And then there was the 2020 uprising also, which got a lot deeper in some very important ways than that initial wave of resistance. It wasn't just focused on Trump. It was much broader and did address a lot of American history. From that experience, there's a lot of weight on people that, well, that didn't work. Well, that's not really the way that change is made. Well, we just have to accept that this is inevitable. Varying themes of that, like the fact that people rose up and then it didn't actually turn out great, that really is weighing on people. But I think people need to draw the correct lessons from that. There was not nearly enough. The kind of fight that it will take to stop American fascism in this period is going to be enormous. The idea that the resistance in the first Trump term was like just constant and just so much, and we don't need that again. That is bullshit. We need much, much more. I do want to take on this performative thing in particular real quick, because this is one of these things that has currency that people just broadly, when it's brought up, people give it a lot of room to breathe. And I want to ask people to think about, like, what does that actually mean? I think it's performative when a city takes down a racist statue and then increases their police budget. That is performative. But is it performative for people to go out to a protest, to bring people out to a protest against something outrageous, and then, worst case scenario, that be the only thing that they do? No. But when people raise this specter of performativity, what a lot of people are saying is that the only thing that matters is voting. And so anything else is performative. Or alternately, the only thing that matters is direct action. Anything else is performative. The only thing that matters is charity. People dress it up as mutual aid. And anything else is performative. But we actually live in a society. We live in a society where, with all of the power imbalances and all of the relations of political power, we actually need to be having society-wide conversations and confrontations over the direction that our society is going in. And we are not used to this as people in the belly of the beast. But that symbolism, the performance of mass demonstrations, these are actually really vital to that process.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the way that it can inspire people. I mean, sometimes it's talked about like it's just a feel-good action. It's just a way to blow off some steam and to feel good and be around other people like you. And you know what? It can be, right? It can be. There's a way that if that's all that there is, and especially if the demands and the spirit are incommensurate with the danger you face, that there's a way that just, it doesn't hit anything. And then it is a means of public therapy, right? Especially, just a perfunctory Saturday march where you're not interrupting or disrupting anything. You're just going to be with the people you're already with and to say the things that people already feel. And I'm not saying that people should stop doing those. Let me be clear. If we're going to have society-wide mass refusal, there's going to be lots of different things that are needed and lots of things that people do. And if more time is spent on poo-poo this and poo-poo that, we're not going to get anywhere. But I do think that there is something to when you have an action and you have not hundreds, even if it's tens of thousands And people plant themselves in the streets, and they do it in a way that business as normal cannot function.
Right.
You know, and to be clear, right here, I'm talking about nonviolent mass action in this context, where people are going out and saying, we're not going to stand with this. We're not going to allow this fascist agenda to go forward. It helps pull people off the sidelines. It helps break through the demoralization, helps break through the sense of hopelessness. And people begin to see themselves and the things that they could be part of. And these actions can also challenge people. They can be done in such a way that people begin to confront that if I don't oppose it, that if I'm not standing with those people in the streets, and I'm not saying in the name of humanity we refuse to accept fascism with them, then I'm complicit in all the horrors that this regime is promising. And I think that it's not a matter of shame, right?
Right.
But it is a matter of like, there's two futures on the line, and which one are you going to get down with? Because things are moving, whether you're moving or not. And so I think that there's a lot that it can do in terms of inspiring and motivating and bringing people together who you don't see normally together.
Right.
And from there, it doesn't stop. From there, people need to take all sorts of action so that it's all of society that's part of this mass refusal. It's the doctors, it's the lawyers, it's the artists, it's the academics, you know, it's the campuses pulsing with sit-ins and all of it is needed, but it has to become such a force that there's not a section of society that is not disrupted by the refusal.
Right.
I just wanted to put in forward some nuance, and I also wanted to go back to some of the difference between now and then. And I just want to be clear that had people done what Refuse Fascism was calling for, we wouldn't be in this situation. So when people say, we did everything and it didn't work. No, you didn't. And I say that with a lot of love to a lot of people, but you didn't. You didn't do it. You didn't do it.
Right.
And then, you know, there's our responsibility that we didn't compel people enough to do it, right? Didn't make enough of a case. You know, there's all sorts of shortcomings that we could sum up. Now is not the time to do that. But people did not rise in mass again and again and again and again in such a way that shut down all of society. That didn't happen.
Right.
And there was not the mass demand for the regime's removal such that they were compelled to be removed. That didn't happen.
Right.
Back to now and people looking at the streets being empty. I think that part of what we have to do is like, because you're thinking, shit is so much worse now. And people are not doing things. And I think that sometimes when things are even worse now and people think that they tried everything and then they find out, what the fuck? This country is so much more filled with fascists than I even thought. People saw all that shit and said, thumbs up. Yeah, fuck this country. We can't just tell each other to not be demoralized.
Right.
Because the morality of so many of the people living in this country is pure rot. Like, it's moral rot. If all you see is that, and all you look at is what you see on the surface, that nobody seems to be saying or doing anything to stop this.
Right.
And what can only me do? That would feel terrible. Like, I'm not trying to talk to people like children, but like, that sucks. That sucks to be like, this is this country. And I think that can also be a really powerful first step. Right. Is to be like, this is a good section of the country. It is not everyone. And they are not the majority, as I said before, because what is it, like 29% of the population voted? I think that there is a first step of coming to grips with that this is a force, that there is a fascist base. A lot of people believe that people will just look at facts. Right. And look at harm and automatically say no. And I think this is a really great opportunity for people to consider where this comes from, where this fascist base comes from, and also to consider the ways that people's actions have been channeled and continue to be channeled that leads people away from the action that's needed. Right. And so I kind of wanted to go there next in our conversation about one of the reasons why we don't see people in the streets is this demoralization, right? Is this paralysis, right? That we got into. That if you see nothing, there continues to be nothing. But like, I do think that there is nothing, you see nothing, you believe that nothing can change because that's So American of us, and that does come to the stability of this country. Part of that is that, there was 2020. And I do think that people very quickly forget that there were huge uprisings, right? The biggest sustained uprising in this country for Black lives. But I think that people also forget how quickly things can change and that we can change things.
Right.
That tyrants do get toppled. That what is not all that they can be. And that beneath the surface, there continues to be. And this is something that does continue to work in our favor, but we cannot rely on in and of itself. The majority detests everything that Trump and MAGA represent. The majority is disgusted. The majority do have feelings, no matter how amorphous, no matter how out of line some of us feel that they are with America, but feelings of liberty and justice and freedom for all, and that rights should be expanding, not restricting. That is actually a strength on our side.
Right.
But I do want to pivot a little bit in the conversation. I don't know if you want to.
No, there's a few things that you were leading to that I really do want to get into. I mean, one thing that I want to circle back eventually is that, we're talking about massive resistance on a scale that we haven't seen. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people. And one thing that I think happens is that people are like, yeah, that's what we need. I don't know where to start. So I do want to get back to that.
Yeah.
That needs to happen quickly. It's not like a gradual process, but there are important actions that need to be taken, can and need to be taken by small groups of people. We'll circle back. But the other part is about the decent people. What we have talked about, what we've deemed for sometimes convenience, but for other reasons too, like the decent people, the non-fascist people in this country. And I think that I take a lot from Bob Avakian's analysis of the two countries within this one country, where we really do have people living in just radically different ideas of the country that we're in and what's good, what's bad, what is true versus, what my leader tells me to believe. And even though it's a smaller majority than it may have been at some point, the majority are the people who are not fascists. We don't need to win over fascists. We said something a few weeks ago about how the only way that the Union beat the Confederacy in the American Civil War, the way that came to be was that at a certain point, a couple of years into the war, they decided to stop trying to win over the Confederates. And we're like, no, we just have to actually beat them. We have to decimate them. We have to, in that situation, beat them on the battlefield, but also not just promise them, oh, well, you can do a little slavery here or a little slavery there. No, the only way we can win this is saying that's absolutely morally reprehensible. We're not doing any of that. And we're going to beat the people who did that. And now it's not really that defined by states. It's not like some states are full of fascists and some aren't. There is an uneven distribution for sure, but this is a nationwide situation, in some ways global. I think that what our task needs to be is not to try to win over fascists, not to try to find common ground, but actually work on the decent people to transform these tens of millions of people into a force that could actually defeat the fascists. And then we can pick up the pieces. That's a big thing. But this is what our task, this is what our listeners' task, this is what our task is to work on the decent people in this country and transform this into something that could fight for a radically better future.
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot of things right now that are holding people back.
Well, one of the things is that people are being convinced that the only way to win is to appeal to fascists.
Right. What are some of the other ways that?
That's one of the main ways. We talked about the way that people are being told that protest doesn't matter and it doesn't work.
Well, I think that there's more we could talk about in terms of tuning out.
Right.
About focusing on putting our efforts mainly into elections and winning locally.
Right.
And focusing on ourselves and our community.
Right. I mean, there's also the really strong push by a lot of people on the quote unquote left to say, oh no, that's hysteria. This isn't fascism. We're not dealing with fascism.
And we're not going to get to that in this episode because if you're listening, you know it's fascism.
Right. But yeah, so I mean, I think electoralism is one big thing we really need to take on. We've done a couple of episodes this past year, especially more than a couple, that focus on how the institutions of American democracy are not the antidote to fascism. They're actually a precursor. They actually, provide the soil for this.
right now, if you're thinking that you can inculcate your local community with local elections in a political landscape dominated by a totally restructured federal government, it's not real. That's not working in reality. This is a fascist regime that's saying, if you go against us, we're going for your head.
Right.
Look, that's not all rhetorical either. You know, to think that elections that they are increasingly rigging are a solution, the more that you do that, the more time you lose in a fight that we do not have time for.
Right. That we don't have time to lose.
That we don't have time to lose.
Right. I think that one of the things that you're getting at is, well, there's two. There's the elections generally. There's the presidential election. There's the Senate, but there's also this localism. First, I want to talk about the localism because we do live in a society. And especially in this society, like whatever happens in your town is intimately bound up with what's happening around the world and throughout the country. Any funding to libraries, the rules that doctors are bound by, everything having to do with education. There is no isolation that can protect us. I mean, I think that it's important that we do demand that people don't cooperate.
I was going to say that there does need to be local resistance. And there does need to be local defense. And all of that needs to happen.
And big picture resistance has to happen on the local level too.
Exactly. That's both ways. But I agree that that's not how the world works. We're intimately connected in ways that in which that the idea that you think that this is a safeguard is not. And then there's also the moral aspect of it.
Yeah, no, because especially in American history, localism has been, that's been the Klan's bread and butter. Right. That's been, even before this was a nation, localism has always.
Like the idea being not in my backyard by localism. All I can do is focus on my community. And this is not saying that people shouldn't focus on their community, that people should let roundup of immigrants happen, let hospital workers be harassed, all that shit. No, fuck no. But to think that we're just going to focus on what's happening in our backyard and that's all we can do and all we can accept and what we should fight for means that you are going to leave the vast majority in a MAGA nightmare, and ignoring the fact that won't work, that's a strategy to fail. How well did that work in historical examples of fascism?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm sure there are people who would debate about Spain and stuff like that, but they did lose. But I do want to shout out before we move on. So the election part, Jefferson Cowie, again, someone who I want to shout out our episode and also his book, Freedom's Dominion, about the history. It's not only about localism, but that's a key ingredient in the history of this notion that American freedom, meaning American freedom for white Americans, means that you can get away with anything, that you could kill a man and remain free. That's what American freedom and that's what protecting my community has meant throughout American history.
Thanks for that reminder. I don't want to really spend that much more time now on the insanity behind the belief that we can focus on 2028.
The one thing I will say is that people who think that elections are a solution, the American fascist movement is not primarily an electoral movement. And somehow they keep winning the elections. I think people need to marinate on that. It is a movement of churches. It is a movement of fraternal organizations, which is how they sell the Proud Boys, and it's also how they sold the Klan initially. It's a movement of powerful interests that want to run roughshod over anyone who gets in their way and anyone who they see as subhuman. So I do want to put that out there. They know that it's not about elections. And while we can't use those same forms, we shouldn't use those same forms, we need to be organizing way beyond. So Sam, I feel like there's two places we could go, and maybe you could speak to both of them. But one of them is this, in the face of all this, people widely tuning out. And then the commentariat taking that tuning out to another level as a political force. So I feel like that.
Yeah. I think that people, look, that is real. People are doing it. I'm not going to be like, no, nobody's tuning out. People are tuning out, and I think that there's a good makes you smile, or it makes me smile, Substack, not Substack. What do you call an individual post on Substack? Do you call it a Substack? Is there a word for it? There probably is, and I don't know it. I will just say there's a post on Paul Street's Substack, the Paul Street Report, available at paulstreet.substack.com. Stupid stuff to stop saying in 2025, and 4 additions to my list of stupid political stuff to stop saying in 2025. And it does go into that, like that tuning out.
Yep.
And like what to say to it.
I do want to say I hate the title of that article because there's so much about like language policing and people being like stuff not to say. No, it's like stuff not to think. So I do want to put that out there. But
it's not that people should just stop saying it. People should stop thinking it.
Should
I think is Mark's point. But like, I do think that I wanted to bring it up because it does have some of the burning questions that we've definitely gotten that are not posed as questions, but statements. And in the I've got to step away is one of it. I think that the way that Paul takes it on is talking about the morality aspect and what it says about our society and what it says about us as people if we think that we can tune that out.
Say more.
If you think that you can close your eyes to the ripping of families apart by the forcible rounding up, what does that actually mean? That means people coming into churches. That means they get their way. That means the military, National Guard, like kicking through the doors of churches, kicking through meatpacking plants, raiding factories, raiding schools. They want to change the law so that they can go into schools and ICE can take children.
Hospitals.
That means taking people from hospital beds, ripping them up to round them up. That means putting people in concentration camps and sending them, in many cases, back to their death. That is not the only thing that they promised to do. We could go through the list, but like that alone, if ethnic cleansing through mass deportations is something you think that you can turn away from, that you can tune out from because you're too exhausted, you have lost any sense of humanity that you believe that you have.
Right.
But also
no matter if it's because you say you're tired or burnt out.
Or it's just too upsetting.
Right.
Look, if it's too upsetting, get off your ass and do something about it. Do you know who it's too upsetting to? It's too upsetting to the people who this regime is intent on destroying the lives, the rights, the humanity of. This is too upsetting to those that this regime has deemed as subhuman and unworthy of rights, dignity, or life. It's the moral rot that I was getting at before that, in my opinion, comes from the economic system that dominates. It's not divorced from the fact that we live under a system of capitalism, imperialism that shapes even the way that we see ourselves, we see each other. And that's rotten to its core. It's a system that I think needs to be done away with. But even if you don't see it that way, I think that if you're listening to us still, I commend you, salute you. I think that all of y'all that are listening to this, you're not tuning away. This is why you're still listening to the Refuse Fascism podcast. It's why I hope you're sharing it with others. But I know that folks that are listening are like, how can people be tuning this out? And what do I say to the people that are tuning it out? And first of all, like, I think part of it is having a little bit of like sense of why people are tuning it out. Because again, if all you think that you can do is be a thorn in their side, is like quietly register your dissent, or even if all you think you can do is bear witness to atrocity, which I think is what a lot of people think that tuning in means. That if I listen, if I look, all I can do is bear witness to it. And yeah, that would be awful. But the point of looking, the point of tuning in is to take that understanding of that threat, of the reality that this is a regime that imperils humanity and the planet itself, and we can't let that stand. And then act on that. That's what tuning in is for. And I think that we do have to get why people are shutting their eyes and closing their minds. And again, if you're listening, that's not you. But you've probably felt the urge, if you're being honest, and you've definitely encountered this from others. And I just want to say that just because others are tuning out doesn't mean that you stop telling the truth. You know that being the thorn in the side of fascism won't cut it, that we need to defeat this. I think that, as Mark was talking about earlier, working on the decent people, part of that means being the thorn in the side of people looking away. it doesn't rely on like just shaming people into it. People look when they're encouraged, when they're challenged, when they feel that looking will lead to an action, that acknowledging it will give people a sense of what they need to fight against and something that they're fighting for. And part of that means exposing and opposing everything that Trump and the MAGA fascists are doing, saying, and promising to do, and being quite relentless on this, on showing people what they can do. And that's going to mean different things for different people.
Right.
We said this before, but I think it's worth underscoring. If people are only looking to the official channels and the electoral system, the institutions, the courts, then things are basically hopeless. But that's not our avenue. I might have mentioned this last week, I'm not sure, but there are things that even those who think they can tune it out will not be able to tune out any longer. Even if people aren't doing things now, that doesn't mean that they won't. There will be moments when things change very quickly. And that is partially why we need to act now.
Yes.
Because we need to be poised when opportunities arise and when necessity arises to bring that force to bear. We could go through, and maybe we should go through, some examples where people have been passive for decades around an issue and suddenly erupt into a force that inspires the world. Black Lives Matter was one of them. But there are others that maybe we should go through. And I mean, the women in Iran, I think, are a great example.
The thing in South Korea right now, regimes all over the world have been driven out by sustained mass action where people become ungovernable. I mean, I think that one thing with this very widely held idea that there's nothing that we can do, this thing in particular, you know, it's only one expression of many paralyzing things, but this idea that I'm just one person, or that, you know, nothing ever changes for the better, all of those ideas. And we're saying that we believe that we can actually win, that we can fight. We have an idea of what that radically better world could look like. We're promoting
that. It's not just a moral stand.
It's not just a moral stand. But even if you don't believe that yet, what we need a lot more of is people searching for those answers, being like, this is so detestable, so horrific. And yet I have information at my fingertips that people throughout human history could not even imagine. So horrific that maybe I'm going to look into, is there a way that we can challenge this? Is there a way that we can change this? Is there a way that we can defeat the bad thing? Maybe even make a better future? I think that that notion has been so wiped away from even the possibility of like, well, it's either bad or good. It's either Democrat or Republican. But it's like, actually, it takes some work. But I think people need to be searching their souls, definitely. But also like literally seeking out
information.
Is it true that this is the only way that it can be?
Yeah.
So I wanted to pull that out. But then we have this big list of some really just shitty shit that people have said.
Yeah. We have a big list of shitty shit that people have said. One that I want to get into is a sentence from Liza Featherstone, writing for Jacobin. A better resistance to Trump is possible. The title I agree with. It's time for a mainstream movement against Trumpism is, I guess, what's that called? Not the subtitle, the tagline. There's a line in that. I'm quoting this because this is not against Liza. This is a sentiment that's a lot broader that I want to speak to. They write, quote, a movement against a second Trump term should organize around issues with a broad popular appeal, end quote. So on one hand, look, being against fascism should have broad popular appeal, and it largely does.
It does.
Tens
of millions of people.
It does. The majority don't want fascism. So on that, I will say that. But that's not actually, if you read through what is being suggested, what's being suggested is an economic movement around
grocery prices,
tariffs, and around
education in a very broad sense. These are the specific things that she's talking about. I think that the way that it frames immigration is horrific in the sense that it's not saying we need to fight for the lives and the rights of immigrants. It's saying that maybe, depending on how things go, like it could become more popular. You know, we could win some reactionaries to think that immigrants are good for the economy. And that's fucking really, really sad.
Yeah, basically what I wanted to get into was the belief that is undergirding that is that a movement should be rooted in and based in demands that have popular opinion behind them, right? And so you focus on specific issues that have popular appeal behind them. I agree that many are going to go into the streets around different attacks on people's rights.
Mhm.
But the idea that we have to base ourselves in specific things because they are popular
Right.
means in this country, immigrants, migrants, asylum seekers, refugees, and people that are suspected of being in any of those categories are left to the slaughter.
Right.
Because the polarization on immigrants is so bad in this country that you would be accepting 11 million people ripped from their homes, their communities, shoved into buses, planes, dumped in concentration camps, and then thrown out like garbage to their deaths or destitution. What the fuck kind of future does that get you? And the same, quite honestly, would be true about the right of trans folks.
Absolutely.
I don't have enough of the data to talk about what that would mean for lesbian, bisexual, and gay folks, or those who identify as queer. I'm not sure that the polarization has gone in a negative direction that way, but the lack of understanding and the cultural panic that has been created around trans and non-binary community is really, really bad.
With a lot of liberal thought leaders, in the New York Times and from the Democratic Party being like, "Oh, we've gone too far."
We need to rein that back into the patriarchy. So if that's not a broadly popular issue, does that mean that the movement that's fighting Trump and MAGA fascism doesn't take that on, doesn't stand up and defend our trans siblings whose rights and lives are being viciously targeted? Does that mean that we don't stand up and defend the doctors and medical providers that this movement is attacking and threatening? It's morally bankrupt that anyone's rights should be contingent on public opinion. There's been some really bad public opinion in the history of this country, and there continues to be. Look, even if fascism was popular, there should still be a mass movement that stops it, that defeats it. I think that that's worth struggling over. There does need to be a mass movement, and that mass movement needs to come to the fore quite soon and dispel with any notion of wait and see, and then we'll respond, because we've waited and waited, and we've seen, and we've seen. And there comes a time where it is too late to act.
It becomes much harder. It becomes a whole different...
We actually are in this situation where it is much harder. The things that Trump is promising to do very quickly, within weeks, will make it much harder. Going after the media, going after nonprofits, going after the avenues that people can make change, the amount of places,
of education, protections,
the amount of places that protest is criminalized already in ways. So I think that it is much harder. But there also does become a time where you physically can't bring millions into the streets. And we're not there yet. And so we need to act now. That's the point that I wanted to make there. And that we still can.
I feel like this loops into one of the specific questions that we got in the forum right after the election. We had a number of questions that were like, it's apparent that we need an action plan for the next 4 to 6 years. Any thoughts on how we resist? Do we need another uprising, just like what happened in the summer of 2020? But I think that this one actually frames it much better. I feel like people were mad and ready to protest after 2016, and all that was quickly co-opted by the DNC. But this time, people seem to be super pessimistic, resigned, and exhausted. This country is ready to be radical, but how do we get the populace there? What are the ways to get our peers ready to fight? And I think that this is something that we really need to talk about, because,
This was from Max?
Yes.
Thanks, Max.
Thank you, Max. Because as we mentioned, in the first Trump presidency, we were very intimately and hands-on involved in many specific protest actions. And I don't regret it, to be clear. But I also think that whole experience is part of what drove us to make this podcast and to have a focus and a consistent voice for people breaking down what's happening on the biggest scale, analyzing deep issues, fascism, nationalism, patriarchy, and the ways that they're manifesting in this moment. And I think that there's a lot of answers to that question, but one direct answer is that this podcast could actually play a very significant part in that. That's the only reason that this exists. This isn't monetized. I think that if this had existed in 2016 or 2017, we would have been in a much better place. And going back to the idea that the fascists is not just an electoral movement. We do need people's power in the streets, but getting there is a whole process that necessarily includes confronting backwards ideas among the people that are essentially on our side.
Yeah, and I think that there's also a vehicle for unity that people need to see and model. Look, everybody who holds contempt for Trump, Vance, MAGA, they need to be part of refusing to accept a fascist America in the name of humanity. And they need to have their arms wrapped around them. And we need to disagree with each other and not have those disagreements be what stops us from working together, but actually part of strengthening that struggle and that fight to stop this fascism.
Right.
And I think that we do that on the show. And I think that everyone who's listening, knows of other podcasts that talk about fascism and knows of other podcasts that are anti-Trump.
Right.
Knows of other podcasts that interview interesting people. We are not just your rage line. We seek to be a lifeline to a community that's actively resisting, working to defeat, not find some way to work around it, not some way to live with this nightmare, but put an end to it.
Right.
And I think that the fact that this grew out of a movement to drive out the Trump-Pence regime continues to be an asset, that this is not just some kind of ideological exercise divorced from action, but we are completely dedicated to provoking and inspiring, promoting and, amplifying, mobilizing this mass defiance, this mass disruption, this mass refusal to defeat this fascism.
No, absolutely. And something I've run into a number of times back during Trump 1, but also more recently is people well, just call a protest. And I do want to not discount the protests that have been called.
People should join them, and people should bring the demand in the name of humanity. We refuse to accept a fascist America. Look, sorry to interrupt, Mark, but people should be disrupting, finding ways to challenge boldly the inauguration. People should do things in their hometowns too. The Capital One Arena event the night before, that should be disrupted. His victory rally, what the fuck?
I do think this went under the radar. He's brought on an executive producer for his future events. The guy who put together the Madison Square Garden.
Straight up Nazi rally?
Yes, is being given an actual position in the administration.
And you have all these billionaires pouring money into his
inauguration fund.
Now, like the Apple guy.
But yeah, so it would be a good thought experiment for people to be okay, so I'm the person that's going to lead. Can I just call a protest? People should think about things as though they are the one responsible for it, and not then let that weigh them down, with the weight of the world, but be well, okay, so what would work? And that's how we got to this podcast.
I think that's so true, Mark. And I think that one of the ways that people can think about it is, what are the ways that I can take creative action now? Literally, with you're listening to this Monday on your way to work, what are you going to do Tuesday? I'm not saying that there are things we shouldn't be building for and taking more time to do, but there are some things that a few people can do that can really impact things and can be part of calling forth the tens of thousands, the millions that we need very quickly. We're not going to go from 0 to 100 without there being things that really provoke people to consider the need for this mass action and mass refusal. And I think that one of the resources for that is this podcast. So I agree. And I think that this would be a great time to tell people the ways that they can support the podcast.
One is rate and review on every platform or any platform that you listen to, or everyone. I'm down with that. Number 2 is join our Patreon.
Patreon.com/refusefascism.
We've held special events where we're in conversation with our patrons. Spread the word about this. Start a group chat. In Chicago, I know there was a regular conversation about the content of this podcast.
I think in Hawaii, Honolulu. And they're doing an event yesterday.
Great. Do it in person. That would be great. But also...
Yeah, I think they're having a potluck.
I'm just saying that that's one way to
do it. Sorry.
If you have...
WhatsApp group.
Yeah.
Do it in a WhatsApp group.
If you have someone who you talk to about the newest episode of whatever that Game of Thrones knockoff is. If you can organize that kind of group chat, you can organize this kind of group chat.
Speaking of dragons, I don't know. You can find a way to make it work.
Right.
Share it through the app to friends, families. Be sure to comment on our posts on social media. We're at Refuse Fascism. We always could use volunteers, so hit us up.
We do have merch that has Refuse Fascism on it.
Yeah, we have t-shirts and hoodies, and you can see the show note for those links. We also have the classic Refuse Fascism shirt. That definitely helps. Those are just some of the many ideas. We'd love to hear all your ideas on how to promote the show. I'm sure you've got them. You can share your ideas, your questions, your thoughts with us at Refuse Fascism. DM us on all social media platforms. You can reach me personally. You can drop me a line at Samantha Goldman at refusefascism.org. Oh, and yeah, you can find me on TikTok at Sam Goldman RF. Find me on the Twitter hellscape X, whatever the fuck it is these days, Sam B. Goldman. Yeah, so just to close out our conversation.
All of this is to say that we asked ourselves, what's going to stop this? How can we contribute to that? And this podcast was part of our answer to that. And I think it should be part of your answer as well. And we want you to
use this tool and
let us know
part of this community.
Exactly. And let us know how else you're answering that call to refuse fascism.
Yeah, share with us all the ways that you are.
Not necessarily all the ways.
Yeah. Sorry. Share with us
all of the ways that people should know that you are answering the call to refuse fascism.
Thanks, Mark, for coming on and chatting with me.
Wonderful to be here.
We'll do more of it.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to Refuse Fascism. Thanks to everyone who has recently become a patron of the show. And to all those who continue to be patrons. Thanks to those who recently became sustainers to start 2025 off, right? Better, I should say. And to those who continue to be sustainers. Thanks as well to those who made an end-of-year gift to support the pod and Refuse Fascism. Thanks to Richie Marini and Lena Thorne for helping produce this episode. Thanks to incredible volunteers. We have transcripts available for each show. So be sure to visit refusefascism.org and sign up to get them in your inbox each week. We'll be back next Sunday. Until then, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America.